Hello everyone, I'm Laurel Porter and welcome to this bonus episode of Straight Talk with New York Times columnist, author and fellow Oregonian Nick Kristof. Nick has a new book out, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life. We talked about it in our recent Straight Talk episode, but we had so much more we wanted to ask Nick. He agreed to stay for a few more questions. So thanks again for doing that. And once again, I'll tell you how much I loved your book.
Thank you.
Really a great read. Let's talk about the presidential election. You're critical of Donald Trump in your book. What do you think of the current state of the presidential election?
So, yeah, I've known Trump and Biden both for, many years, and there's no way of saying it. I mean, I think Trump is one of the most deceitful people I've known in politics. I think he may well be elected, though. I think the conviction I think it's hard to be a convicted felon and win the presidency, but I do think it's possible. And, if oil prices go up, if we have some health crisis with Biden, I think all those things could move public opinion toward Trump. So I think and it'll depend on a tiny number of voters in just a handful of states, not including Oregonians, unfortunately.
Well, you're also very critical of President Biden in your columns recently and the conflict in Gaza and how he's handled that. You've called his policy in Gaza a moral, practical, and political failure. Now, since then, he has proposed a ceasefire that, with the goal of ending the war in Gaza and also returning scores of hostages to Israel. We're taping this on Thursday, June 6th, and the future of that proposal is uncertain. But what is your current take on the situation and how President Biden is handling it?
So I think I'm glad he made that proposal. I mean, he presented it as Israel's proposal, but it's not clear Israel is behind its own proposal. So I think that was sort of an effective way of putting it out there. I think it's possible that it will be adopted for at least the first stage, but I also think that's probably unlikely. And even if the first stage of that ceasefire is adopted, I suspect it will crumble before it gets to the second stage. More broadly, I think Biden has the right intentions of trying to restrain Israel in terms of bombing and getting more food into Gaza, but I don't think he's used his leverage. And the way you influence other countries is not just by urging them to do the right thing, it's by exercising that pressure. And in the case of Israel, that's the diplomatic backing we provide at the UN, and it's the weapons we provide them, the offensive weapons. And I think that I wish he would use that leverage, because otherwise I fear we're complicit in the catastrophe that is now unfolding in Gaza.
So you want to see him withhold funding for weapons?
Yeah, I'd like to see him condition the use of offensive weapons, the transfer of offensive weapons to Israel, showing more restraint in Gaza and really opening the floodgates in terms of food. And I mean, to his credit, Biden did say he was actually going to do those things, but in fact, the floodgates have not opened. They've become tighter in terms of food, and Israel has gone into Rafah despite, and yet there has been no consequences. And when you create impunity, you incentivize people to ignore your red lines.
How much impact do you think that his handling of the Gaza conflict will have on the election?
I don't know, Laurel. I really don't know. I mean, I think it is more likely that he will lose Michigan, which is a crucial state. If you're Biden, you don't want to lose Michigan. And I think there will be some Michigan voters who will probably stay home. I don't think they'd vote for Trump, but I think they might stay home.
Because they had a large uncommitted vote in their primary, right?
That's correct. That's correct. And there's a large Arab American population in Michigan. I think young people have been somewhat turned off. It's a long way to November, so it may be that people will come around by then. But it's going to be a very tight election, and I don't think that Biden is doing himself favors. I mean, in fairness, of course, look, I'm criticizing him for being too complicit in atrocities in Gaza. He's being criticized, on the other hand, for not being supportive enough for Israel. He's in an impossible situation, and but I still wish he were handling it somewhat differently. And
you're headed over to the West Bank after your book tour. What do you hope to report on? What some of the stories that you're hoping to get?
So Israel was shattered, was enormously traumatized by what happened last October 7th, and I think that has in turn led to more oppressive policies in the West Bank. to more land grabs by settlers, to more violence by settlers toward Palestinians in ways that I think make a two-state solution more difficult and push, it's probably not possible to have peace anytime soon, but what we want to do is create conditions so that peace is possible 5 years from now. And I think instead we may be moving in the other direction. So I want to go back and spend some time on the ground and
talk to people there,
talk to people on both sides.
Well, I want to ask you about a recent column that I really enjoyed, A Case for Hope, and it's on the New York Times audio app too, so people can listen to it as well. And you say, in spite of all the troubles that we have in this country, in spite of the conflict in Gaza, in spite of the college campus demonstrations, the polarization that we see in this country, the division among people, that you are still hopeful. But you say you're not a classic optimist. Will you explain that?
I think I've seen too many massacres to be a classic optimist. I mean, I've seen just how awful people can be to each other, how many folks are dying from overdoses at home or failures in education, et cetera, et cetera. But I also see that when we get it right, we can really do amazing things. And I think that compared to 20 years ago, we have a much better toolbox. We understand better how to get people through school, how to intervene abroad, and how to save lives. This year maybe the worst thing that can happen to any parent is to lose a child. Mm-hmm. And when I was born, 1/5 of kids worldwide died by the age of 5. When I graduated from college, 11% of kids died by the age of 5. This year, we will probably set a new all-time low in the history of humanity of a little more than 3% dying by the age of 5. And that's because we've gotten better in ways that have this enormous impact on families all around the world.
So giving you reason for hope, I can see that. But you write in your book, at the same time, you say the struggle to uncover the truth is more important than ever, given that the undermining of democracy recently. What worries you the most?
So I do think that democracy is really under threat, and I've seen in other countries how democracy can unravel, how civil society can unravel. We have incredible polarization in this country, deep distrust on both sides, and I have a foot, in a sense, on either side of that divide. One foot in rural Yamhill, which votes strongly for Donald Trump, and another foot in kind of the educated internationalist world that is extremely hostile to Trump. And I think and the two sides don't talk. And I think we have to make greater efforts to bridge that divide for the health of our country. And misinformation, disinformation, make that more difficult. We saw that with COVID, where a lot of people didn't get vaccinated and died as a consequence. And but I think it has become way too easy for my liberal world to be condescending to working class Americans, to be disrespectful to faith, which is very important to so many families. And I don't think we try hard enough to reach out to bridge those divides, to bring people together.
We talked about this in our main episode of Straight Talk, when you were the bureau chief in Beijing, in China, for 5 years, and you reported on the massacre at Tiananmen Square, for which you won a Pulitzer Prize with your wife, Cheryl Wudun. What are your thoughts now, as you've seen China assume a greater role in the world and build up its military forces?
So I think China is a real challenge to the U.S. As I try to think what could go wrong over the next decade, maybe the worst thing of all would be a war between China and the U.S., which might indeed go nuclear. And so I do think that we need to fortify Taiwan and the Philippines, for example, to help reduce the risk of that conflict. I think the Biden administration has actually done a fairly good job in Asia. But maybe the even more important thing we can do in the long run in terms of being competitive with China isn't anything we do in Taiwan or in the Pacific. It's to educate our kids here at home, make sure that every kid emerges literate, numerate, with skills that will allow them to compete in the marketplace without addiction, substance abuse problems, without mental health crises. And I don't think we are doing great on that front.
And we talked about so many things, and there's so many examples in your book of harrowing things that happened to you and dangers that you faced. How did all of that impact your wife and your family at home?
It's hard. A reporter, when you're in a conflict zone, adrenaline keeps you going. But if it's your husband or your dad, it's hard. And Cheryl was just a champ in being willing to put up with that and with me. And I have a little bit of spousal advice for your audience. I was in a plane crash in Congo. Cheryl and I were then based in Tokyo for the New York Times, so I was terrified. I pulled out my satellite phone. I called Cheryl up, and I just wanted to hear her voice. But I thought maybe I shouldn't tell her about the plane crash until I'm home, sitting opposite her, can reassure her. So I didn't mention it. And then a little bit later, then I had to call the New York Times foreign desk in New York to tell them, because I wasn't where I was supposed to be, had no idea how I was going to get there. An hour later, unfortunately, somebody from the foreign desk called up Cheryl.
She heard it from somebody else.
That's Cheryl about Nick's plane crash. And so I was busted. And the lesson I learned is that one needs complete transparency with one's spouse in all matters, even plane crashes in Congo. And I've tried to adhere to that.
Very good advice, good spousal advice. Well, speaking of advice, journalism has really changed a lot since you started at the Yamhill Carlton newspaper when you were a kid in Yamhill. What advice do you have for young journalists today?
Boy, we don't have a business model. And, it's kind of a terrifying time, I think, to be a young journalist and to vault into this world that I think has been so good for us, but that has led to 2 newspaper closings a week around the country. More journalists have lost jobs than coal miners have. And that's an enormous loss for these communities that, if you don't have oversight and accountability coming from a news organization, then I think governance suffers. And but I do believe that news has real intrinsic value. I think that business models will emerge to pay for that. I'm not quite sure what they are. And so I would encourage young people to come into this field. I think the skill set you learn is also transferable to other areas. And so it may be a roller coaster ride, but there is a satisfaction and a sense of purpose that I think we can have in journalism, as long as it's also escorted by a certain amount of humility.
And for any young journalist, I really recommend your book, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life. Anything else you'd like to add, Nick?
Just, this is something we talked about, on air, but there is so much despair, especially among young people. And it's, you see why. I mean, they can't afford a home. They're worried about climate change. Democracy is under threat. And those are real challenges. But I also think that maybe we in journalism sometimes inadvertently amplify this negativity because we cover planes that crash, not planes that land. But there are a lot of planes that are landing. There has been a lot of progress, material progress, but also moral progress. And I think that if we bear that in mind, that backdrop in mind, then that maybe better prepares us to tackle these very real challenges that remain around us.
Well, Nicholas Kristof, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us in this bonus episode of Straight Talk and sharing your book with us, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life. Thanks for joining us here for this bonus episode. And thank you for watching and listening. I hope you'll join us next week for Straight Talk. Have a great week.